Girl dies in an earthquake, returns with a horrifying warning for her little brother. The ground trembled beneath their feet, at first just a slight rumble, the kind that could be ignored if you weren't paying attention. But then it grew. The floor creaked and groaned, and the walls started to crack. The sound was like 100,000 whispers, a cacophony that built and built until it felt like the world itself was coming apart. "Diana?" Maria's voice trembled as she reached for her daughter, her hands slipping out from under the grip of the heavy table. The house, once so familiar, now seemed like a cage, trapping them inside as the earth below churned in violent protest. Maria could hear the panic creeping into her own voice, but there was no stopping it. Her heart raced as she scrambled for her children, trying to gather them to safety. Diana, just a girl of 7, gripped the side of the kitchen counter, her wide eyes locked on the trembling ceiling above them. The noise grew louder now, an overwhelming roar that drowned out every other sound. It was like the earth itself was screaming in pain, its cries shaking the very bones of the house. Diana's little brother, Luca, barely 3 years old, clung to her leg, confused, scared. "Mommy, what's happening?" Luca's voice was small, barely more than a whisper against the groaning of the house. His big brown eyes searched his sister's face, desperately looking for some kind of reassurance that she couldn't give. She had no answers, no way to protect them. They were trapped, and the world was collapsing around them. "It's okay, Luca," Diana said, her voice steady despite the tremor in her own body. She reached down, scooping him into her arms just as the walls shook again, this time harder, louder. The house seemed to sway, the windows rattling, as if it were made of nothing more than cardboard and glass. Diana gritted her teeth, trying to remain calm as the ground beneath her feet shifted with an unnatural force. Her heart was racing, her stomach churned, and the air around them was thick, heavy with fear. "Mommy!" Luca cried, his tiny arms wrapping around his sister's neck as he buried his face into her shoulder. She could feel his small body trembling, and she pressed him closer, trying to shield him from the terror that surrounded them. But she was just a little girl herself. How could she protect him from this? Maria's legs wobbled, the strength draining out of her as the ground quaked beneath her. She stumbled back, but there was nowhere to go. The house was shaking too violently now. The walls were cracking, the floors buckling beneath their feet. Maria could feel the panic rising in her chest as she scrambled toward the doorway. She couldn't lose them. Not like this. Luca's cries were growing louder, more frantic. "Mommy!" he screamed, his voice barely audible over the roar of the earthquake. He clung to Diana, his small body racked with sobs, but she could do nothing but hold him, her arms trembling under the weight of his fear. Diana couldn't find her own strength in that moment, but she couldn't show it to her little brother. He needed her. The sound of the house shaking and cracking intensified, and Maria felt a terrible realization take root. There was no escape. There was no time. The house was collapsing under the violent tremors, and all she could do was hold her children close, praying for a miracle. "Mommy, help!" Diana cried out, her voice desperate as she stumbled backward toward the door. Maria moved instinctively, but the doorframe gave way with a loud crash, splintering in the middle of the shaking, sending a jolt of terror through her body. She reached out just as the ceiling overhead began to cave in, the weight of the roof pushing down with an unforgiving force. Maria screamed, reaching for Diana, but it was too late. There was no time left. The walls buckled, the floor cracked wide open, and before Maria could reach her children, the ceiling collapsed in a terrifying crash, sending a mountain of debris raining down. Everything happened in an instant. A blur of noise, of screaming, of falling beams, of the world unraveling. The light flickered, and then everything went dark. Diana's hands slipped from Maria's, her small fingers disappearing into the rubble as the house crumbled around them. Maria's heart twisted in her chest as the house seemed to collapse further in on itself, swallowing her daughter, swallowing her son, swallowing everything. But then, just as quickly as the chaos had erupted, it stopped. The tremors slowed, the shaking subsided. The silence that followed was deafening, an oppressive, suffocating quiet that seemed to stretch on forever. Maria gasped for air, her lungs burning, her body pinned beneath the weight of debris. Her eyes darted around, her heart pounding as she searched for her children. Diana? Luca? Maria called, her voice hoarse and weak. The air was thick with dust, and it made it hard to breathe, but she pushed forward, her hands trembling as she dug through the rubble. The house was still smoking, the smell of burning would thicken the air, but she couldn't stop. She couldn't give up. Not when they were still out there. She clawed at the debris, her hands bloody and raw, but the weight was too much. She couldn't move the beams. She couldn't get through to them. The realization hit her like a slap in the face. She was trapped. There was nothing she could do. The noise of the earthquake had stopped, but the world was still spinning out of control. Her hands shook violently as she pulled at the rubble, but there was no answer. No sign of Diana. No sign of Luca. Her heart clenched as the desperate silence enveloped her. She called their names again, louder this time, her voice breaking with each syllable. She wasn't ready to give up. She couldn't be. But the world had already taken them, and as the pain of loss overwhelmed her, Maria's vision blurred, her strength ebbing away. The weight of the house pressed down on her, trapping her, but her mind raced with the images of her children. She couldn't lose them. Not like this. Then, through the haze of dust and smoke, Maria thought she heard something. A faint, distant voice, a whisper. It was small at first, almost drowned by the devastation, but it grew louder. It wasn't her own voice. It wasn't her children's voice. It was something else. Something wrong. Diana? Luca? Maria gasped, barely able to breathe as she struggled against the weight pressing down on her. But the voice came again, louder this time. And it was clear. It was a child's voice. But it was not one that Maria recognized. Mommy, I'm sorry. Maria's breath caught in her throat as the voice echoed again, louder this time, sharp and clear, too clear to be a figment of her imagination. She paused, her body frozen beneath the heavy rubble, her hands trembling as they scraped against the jagged edges of fallen debris. The voice, it was a child's voice, soft and familiar, but at the same time, completely foreign. It had a strange quality to it, like a whisper that didn't belong in this world. Mommy, the voice whispered again, and this time, Maria's heart stopped. The breath she had been holding escaped her in a ragged gasp. Mommy, it's me, Diana. Her blood ran cold, and the world seemed to spin around her. She couldn't breathe. She couldn't move. The weight of the rubble around her pressed down with suffocating force, but the sound of her daughter's voice reverberated in her head, clear and unmistakable. Maria's mind raced, trying to make sense of what was happening. Diana couldn't be alive. She couldn't be speaking to her. She had heard the crash. She had seen the ceiling come down. Diana was gone. She had to be. But the voice came again, louder now, cutting through the thick dust and smoke. It was as though it was coming from just beyond her reach. Mommy, don't be afraid, the voice trembled with something between sorrow and urgency. I'm here, Mommy, but you have to listen. Maria's pulse quickened as the air around her seemed to grow colder, the hairs on the back of her neck standing on end. It wasn't possible. It couldn't be. But the voice, the words, everything about it felt so real. Her heart ached, and her throat tightened with the weight of grief she could barely carry. She called out, her voice shaky, her hands clawing at the wreckage around her. Diana? Is that you? Maria's voice broke, desperate for a sign, for something that would confirm this wasn't just a hallucination. But deep down, she feared that whatever was happening now wasn't just a trick of her mind, it was something else. The voice answered again, this time with a note of pleading. Mommy, you have to listen to me. Luca, he's in danger. The words sent a chill through Maria's body, a shockwave of fear rushing through her veins. Luca, her son, her baby, was still somewhere in the ruins of the house. She hadn't been able to reach him. She hadn't been able to protect him from the collapse. Luca, Maria gasped, her voice barely a whisper as the thought of him alone in the wreckage flooded her mind. The last thing she had seen was her son clutching Diana, both of them barely standing when the ceiling caved in, and the memory of that image haunted her, filling her with a fear unlike any she had ever known. Was Luca? Was he still alive? The air in the room seemed to grow heavy with the weight of the question, and for a moment, Maria felt like she couldn't breathe. She struggled to push the debris off her body, her hands shaking uncontrollably as she tried to move the wreckage that pinned her to the ground. It was no use. Every time she moved, she was met with more resistance, more rubble that blocked her path. But the voice, Diana's voice, clear and insistent, didn't let up. "You have to find him, Mommy. It's not too late." The voice softened for a moment, a note of tenderness breaking through the urgency. "You have to save him. You promised?" The word struck her like a physical blow. The promise she had made to both of her children, that she would always protect them, that no harm would ever come to them. The weight of that promise felt unbearable now. She had failed. She had failed them both. But hearing Diana's voice now, hearing her plead for Luca, something inside Maria stirred. She couldn't let him be lost. She couldn't let him suffer alone. With a new surge of strength, Maria pushed against the rubble again, this time with more determination. The sound of Diana's voice was like a spark in the dark, lighting a fire inside her chest. She had to find Luca. She had to save him. But just as she was about to make another attempt, another voice cut through the stillness, this one not from the rubble, but from the shadows. "You can't go after him." "Not yet." Maria froze, her heart leaping into her throat. The voice was cold, distant, and utterly unfamiliar. It was male, deep, and filled with an eerie command that sent chills down her spine. Maria twisted her body, trying to find the source, but there was no one. There was no one there, only the rubble, only the darkness that surrounded her. Who are you?" Maria's voice trembled with fear, but she wasn't sure whether she was speaking to the stranger or to the memory of her daughter. The world seemed to blur, the edges of reality melting into something otherworldly. The voice responded, but this time, there was no mistaking the malice in its tone. "It's too late for him." The voice was thick with contempt. "Your son is already gone. You'll never find him." Maria's chest constricted, the words cutting through her like a knife. The air around her grew heavy again, and she felt a chill that seeped into her bones. Her heart raced. This was a nightmare. This couldn't be happening. But Diana's voice returned, soft but fierce, cutting through the darkness like a thread of light. "No, Mommy, you have to keep going. You can find him." Maria's breath came in ragged gasps as she pulled herself from the rubble, her hands aching as they scraped against the debris. There was no time for doubt, no time for the strange voice that lingered in her mind, filling her with dread. Diana was still with her, somehow, somewhere. And that was all that mattered. Her eyes burned with tears, but she refused to let them fall. She couldn't give in. Not now. Not when there was a chance to save Luca. Maria's hands were raw and bloodied as she pushed the rubble aside, her breath coming in ragged gasps. The weight of the debris was immense, the shattered walls and beams pressing down on her with unforgiving force. But the image of Luca, his small, terrified face, pushed her forward. The voice of Diana had given her hope, even if it was mingled with dread. The other voice, the strange, malicious one, still echoed in her ears, but she didn't have time to consider it. She couldn't. "I will find you, Luca," she whispered through gritted teeth, her voice breaking as she shifted more debris from her body. "I won't give up." Every part of her ached. Her body felt like it was made of lead, every movement slower than the last, but she kept going. The space around her seemed to close in, and the suffocating silence made her feel like she was drowning. She called Luca's name again, her voice hoarse, barely a whisper, lost to the heavy dust that filled the air. "Luca? Luca," she called, her voice cracking on his name, but the response was always the same, silence. Her heart raced in her chest, the fear building with each second. Was he okay? Was he even alive? She didn't dare imagine the worst. She couldn't. With one final push, Maria freed herself from the debris, her body trembling with exhaustion. Her hands, though scraped and battered, were still capable. She could feel the blood seeping from the cuts, but it didn't matter. There was only one thing in the world that mattered now, finding Luca. She needed to see him, to hold him. She had to believe he was still out there. But the house was in ruins. Every wall she saw, every corner she turned was a reminder of how much had been lost in an instant. The memories of a home, of a life once lived, were now nothing more than dust and shattered glass. The very air around her was thick with the smell of burning timber and crushed stone, and it made her dizzy. But she couldn't stop. She had to find him. As she moved further into the wreckage, the silence was broken again, this time by something faint but unmistakable. A soft, muffled sound. A cry. Her heart stopped and she froze in place. It was the sound of a child's sob, weak and distant, but unmistakable. It sent a surge of hope through her chest, and for a brief moment she thought maybe, just maybe, Luca was still alive. Her legs gave out beneath her, and she fell to her knees, the weight of the moment nearly too much to bear. "Luca," she whispered, her voice desperate, barely a breath. She crawled forward, moving as quickly as she could, her hands trembling as she pushed aside broken bricks and wood. The sobs continued, and her heart began to race, her pulse pounding in her ears. "Luca? Luca, please?" She called out again, louder this time, her voice filled with urgency. But when she finally reached the source of the sound, her stomach sank. It wasn't Luca. There, in the midst of the wreckage, was a small, lifeless body. A child. Not Luca, but another child, barely older than Luca himself. Maria's heart shattered as she knelt beside the small form, her hands trembling as she brushed the dust from the child's face. The boy's eyes were closed, and his body was twisted in an unnatural way, as though he had been caught in the rubble and had never had a chance to escape. His face was covered in dirt, but the traces of tears still streaked his cheeks. Maria's throat tightened as she choked back a sob. She couldn't bear it. Another innocent life lost. Another child stolen by the violence of the earthquake. But this child wasn't her son. Her eyes darted around desperately, looking for any sign of Luca. "Luca? Luca?" she cried out again, her voice breaking in her throat. But the only answer was the wind, howling through the cracks in the walls, carrying with it the weight of the destruction. As her body sagged in despair, she heard the voice again, Diana's voice. But this time, it was different. It was no longer filled with the urgency of before. It was calmer, softer. "Mommy, you're close?" Maria's breath caught in her throat. Diana's voice, clear and certain, rang through the air like a bell. It was so close now. But how? How was this possible? Her daughter had been buried under the rubble, gone. Yet here she was, speaking to her, guiding her. Maria wanted to scream, to question how this could be happening, but she knew there were no answers. Only the deafening silence that followed the shaking of the earth. "Diana?" Maria whispered, her voice trembling. "Is it really you?" But her words were met with only silence. The child's sobs had stopped, leaving only the heavy stillness. The ground beneath her seemed to shift again, and Maria's heart skipped a beat. She glanced around, her senses heightened, as if something was lurking, waiting for her. But when she looked back at the small form of the child in the rubble, the air shifted again, thick, almost suffocating. Something was wrong. The weight in her chest grew heavier, and for a moment, she felt like she couldn't breathe. The walls seemed to close in again, the tremors returning in small, rapid bursts. But this time, they were softer, less violent. Just enough to make her doubt everything around her. A cold chill ran down her spine, and she realized something else. She wasn't alone. Not in the way she had hoped. Her eyes darted across the wreckage again, and the world felt too quiet, too still. And then, in the corner of the room, where the shadows seemed to twist unnaturally, Maria saw it. A figure. The outline of a person, no, something else, emerged from the dark, and Maria's heart skipped a beat. Maria's heart thudded in her chest, her breath caught in her throat as she stared at the dark shape moving slowly from the corner of the room. At first, it was just a shadow, a shifting silhouette that could have been nothing more than her imagination playing tricks on her, but then it moved again, more deliberately this time, and Maria's pulse quickened in fear. She couldn't move. Her body was frozen in place, as though the weight of the air itself was holding her down. The figure stepped forward from the shadows, and in the dim light, Maria could make out the outline of a person. It wasn't human, not entirely. The shape was too distorted, too wrong. The edges of it seemed to flicker like the fading remnants of a nightmare, almost as if it didn't belong to this world at all. A chill raced down Maria's spine, and her hand trembled as she reached out toward the rubble. She had no idea what she was seeing, whether it was a trick of the mind, a hallucination brought on by the trauma, or something far more sinister. Her thoughts spun out of control, racing as she tried to understand what was happening. But one thing was clear: this wasn't just fear. This wasn't a normal moment. Something else was in play, something that was beyond her understanding. And then, as the figure moved closer, the air in the room shifted once again, growing colder, heavier. The hairs on Maria's neck stood on end, a knot forming in her stomach as the figure came into full view. It was a child, a girl, but not Diana. This girl's face was pale, too pale, her features hollow and sharp, and her eyes were empty. Black pits where eyes should have been, staring through Maria with an intensity that felt like they could see into her very soul. Maria's breath caught in her throat. The girl's mouth moved, but the words didn't reach Maria's ears right away. It was as if the world itself was muffling the sound, as if the very atmosphere around her was pressing in too tightly for anything to break through. And then she heard it. "Mommy." The voice was not Diana's. It was cold and distant, lacking the warmth that had once filled their home. Maria's heart dropped into her stomach, and she couldn't speak. She wanted to run, to scream, to push this nightmare away, but she couldn't move. She couldn't tear her eyes away from the figure standing before her. The girl stepped closer, her movements jerky, unnatural, like a marionette with its strings pulled by an unseen force. Her face twisted into something that was almost a smile, but it didn't reach her eyes. There was no life in them. There was only the darkness and the haunting, insidious presence that filled the space. "Diana?" Maria whispered, her voice cracking with disbelief, but the girl's twisted form did not respond. Instead, she cocked her head slightly to the side, her hollow eyes staring at Maria with an eerie intensity, as though she were seeing something far beyond her. And then, the girl spoke again, but this time, her voice was different. It was deeper, more guttural, like it was coming from somewhere beneath the surface. "Mommy, the warning for Luca? He is not safe?" Maria's chest tightened with a sickening realization. She could feel the presence of dread tightening around her, like a vice. The words that the girl spoke were meant for someone else, someone she had promised to protect. The little boy, Luca. Her son, who had been with Diana when the ceiling had collapsed. She had failed him too. The images of her children, her precious babies, ripped from her arms, filled her mind, threatening to suffocate her. But the girl, it wasn't Diana. This wasn't Diana's voice, and this wasn't the child Maria had spent every moment of her life protecting. The figure stepped closer again, its movements growing more erratic. The face remained frozen in that twisted semblance of a smile, and Maria's fear grew like a beast inside her, clawing at her sanity. She had to protect Luca. She had to find him. But the thing, didn't stop. It kept moving toward her, its eyes dark and empty. With each step it took, Maria's heart pounded faster. She had to get out. She had to break free from this nightmare. She couldn't let this thing take over, whatever it was. But there was no escape. The rubble, the shadows, everything was closing in on her. The figure stopped just in front of her, too close, so close that she could feel the chill radiating from it. The air grew even colder, the room growing darker with each passing second. "Mommy," the thing whispered, its voice now coming from all around her, as if the walls themselves were speaking. "You didn't save him. You didn't protect him. Maria's breath hitched in her throat. "Luca? What happened to him?" Her voice was desperate now, pleading for answers, but the figure just tilted its head, as if mocking her. "He's gone, Mommy." The words were flat, cold, devoid of emotion. "It's too late for him." It was always too late. Maria's entire world shattered in that moment. Her legs gave way beneath her, and she collapsed to her knees in the rubble, her hands shaking uncontrollably as she reached out to the cold, lifeless figure. The thing before her had just taken away everything. Her children, her family, her future, all of it was gone. No, she whispered, her voice breaking as the weight of the truth crushed her. She refused to believe it. She refused to accept it. It couldn't be true. It couldn't be. Her chest tightened with an overwhelming wave of grief and terror. But the thing only smiled, a grin that was twisted and unnatural. Its black eyes seemed to pierce into her soul, and as Maria's world crumbled around her, she could hear the voice once more. It's too late for him, but you can still save the others. Maria didn't understand what it meant. The others? She didn't care about anyone else. Only Luca mattered. Only her son mattered. She had to find him. She had to protect him. She would not let him be lost. Not like this. The thing that stood before her was no longer a child. No longer Diana. Maria's eyes darted around, searching for something, anything to hold on to make sense of this nightmare. But the reality of it, the horror, was too much. The figure's voice was still echoing in her ears, the words swirling like poison in her mind. It's too late for him. Maria's breath came in ragged bursts. She could feel her chest tighten with every word, with every fleeting moment that passed, as the weight of the thing's words sank deeper into her heart. But still, she refused to believe. She couldn't. Luca couldn't be gone. She wouldn't accept it. Not without a fight. Panic seized her body. She scrambled to her feet, pushing the rubble away with a desperation she hadn't felt before. The room around her felt suffocating, the air thick with the dust and smoke that seemed to settle in her lungs. Every movement felt heavier than the last, as if the very weight of the house's destruction was pressing down on her shoulders, threatening to crush her into the ground. She fought against it, pushing harder, faster, as the thing in front of her began to speak again. "Luca is gone, Mommy." The voice was softer this time, almost sympathetic, though it held no warmth. The darkness took him. Maria felt her legs begin to give way once more, the cold that had seeped into her heart spreading to every part of her body. But she fought it. She fought the terror that gripped her chest. She fought the exhaustion, the crushing weight of everything she had already endured. "No," she whispered, her voice raw. She couldn't let herself believe it. She wouldn't. "No, he's not gone. I'll find him. I'll save him." Her words felt hollow, even to her own ears, but she didn't care. She couldn't stop. She couldn't let this thing, this ghost or whatever it was, take her son from her. She wouldn't let it. But the figure stepped forward, its movements slow and deliberate. It towered over her, its presence suffocating, oppressive. Maria's body trembled as she backed away from it, but there was nowhere to go. She was trapped in a ruined house with no escape from the horror that seemed to be closing in around her. The girl's face twisted again into a mockery of a smile. Maria could see the darkness in those eyes, the emptiness that reflected nothing but an endless void. "You can try, Mommy, but it's too late. The world has already taken him." The voice had become more distant, as though it were fading, slipping away from her grasp. "You can't undo what's been done. Stop it." Maria screamed, her voice rising in anguish. She felt the hot sting of tears welling in her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. "I'll find him. I'll save him. I can't lose him." For a moment, the thing before her seemed to hesitate, its form flickering like a shadow cast in the corner of her eye. Maria didn't know if it was the effect of the earthquake, or if her mind was breaking from the strain, but the figure's presence seemed to warp and twist as though reality itself was bending around it. "He's gone, Mommy. You can't save him." The words were final, cold, and carried an unmistakable finality. "You've already lost him." Maria's heart felt as though it were shattering, the weight of the words crushing her chest. She couldn't breathe. She couldn't think. She couldn't focus on anything except the overwhelming ache in her heart. The world had already stolen so much from her. Her home, her life. And now it was taking Luca too. The tears that had been threatening to spill finally broke free, streaking down Maria's face as she sank to her knees in the rubble. She was a mother who had failed. She had promised Luca she would always protect him, always keep him safe. And now the earth had taken him, and she hadn't been able to stop it. She had been too slow, too weak. The thing stepped back, its figure fading into the shadows, its presence slowly evaporating into the thick, suffocating air. Maria's sobs filled the empty space, but they were met with nothing, no comfort, no response. Just the crushing silence of the destroyed world around her. For a long time, Maria stayed on the floor, her body broken, her soul lost in the blackness of the moment. The house felt so still now, so quiet, as if the life had been sucked out of it entirely. And then, through the silence, she heard something. A faint sound, a whisper that sent a shiver through her spine. It wasn't the voice of the thing anymore. It was Luca's voice. "Mommy?" Maria's heart nearly stopped, and she shot up from the ground, her eyes wild as she searched for the source of the sound. The air seemed to pulse with electricity, and for a moment, she could have sworn she saw a flicker of something small, something familiar, moving just beyond the wreckage. Her breath caught in her throat. It couldn't be. It couldn't be him. But the voice was so clear, so unmistakable. "Luca," she whispered, her voice barely audible, her hands shaking as she reached out in the direction of the sound. There, in the corner of the room, something shifted. A figure, so small and fragile, emerged from the darkness. The air around it seemed to shimmer, like a heat wave distorting the space around it. Maria's eyes locked on the figure, her heart leaping into her chest. "Luca," she gasped again, her voice breaking as the figure stepped forward. And as it came closer, Maria's chest tightened, and the truth she had been trying to avoid struck her like a physical blow. It wasn't Luca. Not entirely. Maria's body froze as the figure stepped closer, emerging fully from the shadows. It was Luca, but something was wrong. Terribly wrong. His small frame, the one she had cradled so many times in her arms, was there in front of her, but he looked different. His movements were stiff, unnatural, as though each step he took required immense effort, like he was being forced forward by something unseen. His face was pale, far too pale, and his once bright eyes were dull, clouded by something Maria couldn't comprehend. A chill settled over her, cold and sharp, as though the air around her had been drained of all warmth. Every instinct in her screamed to go to him, to pull him into her arms and tell him everything would be okay, but her legs wouldn't move. Fear rooted her in place, and her chest tightened with every passing second. "Luca," Maria whispered, her voice trembling. She reached out a hand, but it hung limply in the air, too afraid to cross the space between them. Is it really you?" Luca didn't respond right away. He just stood there, staring at her with those lifeless eyes, his small body swaying slightly, as if he were struggling to stay upright. His clothes were torn and covered in dust, and there were scratches on his face and hands, but there was something else, something that sent a wave of nausea crashing over Maria. His skin was marked with faint, dark streaks that looked like shadows crawling beneath his flesh, moving in slow, undulating patterns. "Mommy," Luca's voice was small, weak, but it sent shivers down her spine. It was him, and yet it wasn't. The tone was off, hollow, as if it were coming from somewhere far away, filtered through a veil of something unnatural. "Help me!" Maria's heart clenched at the sound of his voice. It was the plea of a frightened child, her child, and every fiber of her being wanted to run to him, to scoop him up in her arms and shield him from whatever horror had taken hold of him. But something about the way he stood, the way he moved, it was all wrong. "I'm here, Luca," she said, her voice cracking as tears spilled down her cheeks. "I'll help you. Just come to me, okay?" Luca took another step forward, his movements jerky and disjointed. The shadows beneath his skin seemed to pulse, growing darker, more pronounced. Maria's stomach churned, her mind screaming at her to run, but her heart wouldn't let her. This was her son, her baby. Whatever had happened to him, she had to help him. She couldn't abandon him. "Mommy," Luca's voice trembled, and for a moment, Maria thought she saw a flicker of something familiar in his eyes. "He's coming. You have to stop her. She's going to take me away." Maria's blood turned to ice. She didn't understand. Who's coming, Luca? What are you talking about?" Her voice was frantic now, desperate to make sense of the impossible. Luca's head snapped to the side, as though he had heard something she couldn't. His small body stiffened, and his breathing grew shallow, ragged. He looked back at Maria, and this time, his eyes were wide with fear. The flicker of recognition was gone, replaced by sheer panic. "She's here," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "She's coming for me." The room seemed to shift around them, the air growing heavier, thicker. Maria felt it immediately, a presence, cold and suffocating, pressing down on her chest. It was the same feeling she had felt when the figure of Diana had appeared, but this time, it was stronger, darker. She turned her head, her heart pounding in her chest, and saw it. In the corner of the room, where the shadows clung to the walls like living things, a figure began to emerge. It was slow at first, a shape forming out of the darkness, but as it stepped into the dim light, Maria's breath caught in her throat. It was Diana. Or at least it looked like her. The figure had her daughter's face, her daughter's small frame, but the resemblance ended there. Her skin was pale, almost translucent, and her eyes, those dark, hollow pits, seemed to pull all the light from the room. Her movements were slow, deliberate, and as she stepped closer, Maria could feel the temperature drop further. It was as though the very air around them was being drained of life. "Mommy," the figure said, its voice low and unnatural. "You didn't save me. You couldn't save him either." Maria shook her head, her hands flying to her mouth as tears streamed down her face. "No. No, this isn't real. You're not real. This isn't happening." Her voice was a mix of anger and desperation, but the figure didn't waver. "You let us die," the figure said, its voice twisting into something cruel, inhuman. "You let the earth take us. You didn't protect us. Stop it." Maria screamed, her voice raw with emotion. I tried to save you both." Her sobs racked her body, and she fell to her knees, clutching her chest as the weight of her guilt consumed her. "I never wanted this. I never wanted any of this." But the figure only smiled, its expression cold and devoid of any warmth. "You can still save him, Mommy," it said, its voice soft but chilling. "But you have to make a choice." Maria's head shot up, her tear-filled eyes locking onto the figure. "What choice?" she demanded, her voice trembling. "What are you talking about?" The figure tilted its head, the dark pits of its eyes boring into her soul. "One life for another." Maria's heart stopped. The words hung in the air like a heavy weight, suffocating her. "No," she whispered, shaking her head. "I won't choose. I can't. I won't." But the figure only laughed, a sound that sent chills down Maria's spine. "You don't have a choice, Mommy. If you want to save him, you have to decide." Maria's mind raced, her heart pounding in her chest. She couldn't do it. She couldn't choose. But as she looked at Luca, at the shadows crawling beneath his skin, she realized she was running out of time. Maria's mind was spinning, her heart beating so loudly in her chest it felt as though it could tear her apart. The words echoed in her ears, over and over, like a cruel mantra, one life for another. She could hear the figure's voice in her head, feel the weight of its promise pressing down on her. There was no escaping it. The room felt as though it were closing in, the air thickening with every second that passed. The shadows surrounding the figure of Diana grew longer, stretching toward her like arms that wanted to drag her into the darkness. "I won't choose," Maria whispered, her voice hoarse with terror. "I won't choose." Her hands gripped the floor beneath her, the debris scraping against her skin, but she didn't care. She couldn't care. Her world was collapsing around her, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. The figure of Diana took a step forward, its movements slow and deliberate, as though it was savoring her fear. The room seemed colder with every step the thing took, as if the life was being drained from everything around her. Maria's heart thudded in her chest, and she scrambled backward, trying to get away from it, but there was nowhere to run. The walls were closing in, the ground beneath her feet shaking again with a violent tremor. "You don't have a choice, Mommy," the figure said again, its voice cold and mocking. "If you want Luca to live, you'll have to let go of something. One life for another. That's the way it works." Maria's breath came in short, frantic gasps. She could feel the weight of the decision pressing on her, suffocating her. But no matter how hard she tried, she couldn't bring herself to accept it. She couldn't make that choice. How could she? How could any mother? "I won't choose," she repeated, her voice breaking. "I won't lose another child. I can't. I can't lose him too." Her hands trembled as they reached out toward Luca, who still stood before her, his body stiff and unnatural. The darkness beneath his skin seemed to pulse with each beat of her heart, and she wanted to reach out and hold him, to tell him that everything would be okay. But her heart twisted as she realized that wasn't the truth. Nothing was okay. The world had already taken so much from her. The figure, Diana's twisted form, stopped in front of her, the smile on its face growing wider, more sinister. Maria wanted to scream, to run, to tear herself away from this nightmare, but she couldn't move. The figure was inescapable, suffocating. It wasn't just a shadow, it was a presence, something that loomed over her like an eternal threat. It was as though the very space around her had been corrupted by this thing, by this unholy imitation of her daughter. "You can't run from it, Mommy," the figure said softly, almost kindly, as though it were offering her some sort of mercy. But there was no kindness in those words. There was nothing but malice, a coldness that chilled her to the bone. "The earth has claimed us. The earth has taken us both. You can't undo what's been done." Maria's hands gripped her chest, her body racked with sobs. She couldn't breathe. The pain was unbearable, too much to carry. "I can't lose them both. I can't let you take him too," Maria pleaded, her voice thick with desperation. "Please," her words trailed off as she looked at Luca, at the twisted figure before her that resembled her daughter, but was nothing like her. It was all wrong. This wasn't what she had been fighting for. This was not her child. The figure smiled, and its smile deepened, as though Maria's pain was nothing more than a form of entertainment. "You have to decide," it said, its voice ringing with authority. "Either Luca or yourself. You can't save us both. You can only save one." Maria closed her eyes, the weight of the decision pressing down on her chest. She had been told the truth, had been forced to see the consequences of her failure. She had failed to protect her children, to shield them from this horrible fate. But she couldn't make this choice. The thought of losing Luca, of losing the last piece of her heart, was too much. But the thought of losing her daughter again, of never hearing her voice again, tore her apart. "I can't," she whispered, the words barely escaping her lips. She didn't know what to say. She didn't know what to do. How could anyone make this decision? How could any mother choose between her children? The figure of Diana stepped back, the darkness around it growing deeper, more suffocating. "You have no choice," it said, its voice soft but final. "The earth claims what is its. And you, Mommy, are no exception." And with that, the room seemed to collapse around her. The walls cracked, the ceiling caving in once more as the figure of Diana disappeared into the shadows. Maria felt the ground beneath her tremble once again, this time with a violent, crushing force that shook her to the core. It wasn't the earthquake anymore. It was something else, something far darker, more terrifying. "No!" Maria screamed, her body trembling as the weight of the house around her pressed down. She reached out toward Luca, but it was too late. Her body was pinned down by the rubble, unable to move, unable to save him. For the briefest of moments, she thought she saw him, the real Luca, through the debris, his small face peeking out from behind the remnants of the house. He was alive, but only for a moment. His face twisted in agony, and Maria could see the shadow of something else in his eyes, something that wasn't him, something dark. "Mommy, help me," Luca's voice trembled from beneath the rubble, weak and faint. But as Maria tried to reach for him, the walls of the room collapsed completely, and the light around them was swallowed by the blackness that took everything away. The darkness swallowed everything. The house that had once been filled with warmth and laughter now felt like a tomb. The rubble weighed heavy on Maria's body, her chest heaving as she struggled to breathe in the thick dust that filled the air. Her mind raced, and her heart pounded, but everything seemed muffled, as if the world had been drowned by the horrors of the earthquake and the terror that had followed. "Luca," Maria whispered, her voice raw and desperate, but it was lost in the silence, swallowed by the ruin of their home. She tried to move, tried to push the debris away, but it was too much. The weight of the world was upon her, and every breath she took seemed to become more difficult. She could still hear Luca's voice in her head, his soft cries for help, his plea for her to save him. It echoed in her mind, but there was nothing she could do. The house was a mountain of stone and wood, and no matter how hard she fought, she couldn't escape it. Her hands were covered in cuts, her arms bruised and battered, but she kept fighting, kept clawing at the rubble, unwilling to accept the hopelessness that was closing in on her. The darkness around her deepened, but then, through the haze of dust and smoke, Maria thought she heard something faint, almost imperceptible at first, but unmistakable. The faintest whisper of a voice, distant and soft, like a breeze that barely stirred the air. "Mommy." Maria's heart stopped, and for a moment, everything else disappeared. She tried to sit up, her hands shaking as she pushed the rubble aside, her mind racing with hope, with desperation. The voice was familiar, so familiar. It was Luca. Luca? Maria gasped, her voice a choked cry as she scanned the darkness, her body trembling with anticipation. The air around her felt suddenly alive, as if something had changed, as if the earth itself had released its grip on her. For a fleeting moment, she felt a glimmer of hope that perhaps Luca was still alive, that somehow, through the horror, she could still save him. But then, something caught her eye. The figure, small, fragile, familiar. The outline of a child emerged from the shadows, stepping carefully toward her through the wreckage. At first, Maria couldn't believe it. She thought it was a trick, a hallucination. But the figure was too real, too solid to be a figment of her imagination. It was Luca. His face was pale, his clothes torn and dust-covered, but he was standing, moving toward her. "Luca?" Maria whispered again, her voice trembling with disbelief. "Is it really you?" The child looked at her, his face unreadable. His eyes, those once bright eyes, were now empty, hollow, as though all the life had been drained from him. There was no recognition in them, no warmth. Just emptiness. But he spoke, and his voice was weak, strained, as if it had been dragged from some distant place. "Mommy?" Luca's voice barely reached her, but it was enough to shatter her. "I'm sorry. I couldn't escape." Maria's heart shattered at the sound of his words. She reached out to him, but her hands were shaking too violently. She couldn't touch him. She couldn't bring him close. And as she looked at him, at the hollow, lifeless eyes staring back at her, she realized that this wasn't her Luca anymore. Not completely. The earth had taken him, just like it had taken Diana. "I'm sorry, Mommy," Luca repeated, his voice distant, the words fading as if they were carried on the wind. "I couldn't protect us." The world around Maria seemed to crumble away again, like a dream breaking apart. The air grew colder, and the weight of the destruction pressed down on her once more. She reached for Luca, but he stepped backward, his form flickering in and out of existence like a shadow. Her outstretched hands met only emptiness. "No," Maria gasped, a sob escaping her lips. "Please don't leave me again." But her words were lost, swallowed by the darkness. But as the darkness closed in, something shifted within her. A spark of something, strength, determination, maybe even love, flickered inside of her, and for the first time since the earth had torn her world apart, Maria stood. She wiped the tears from her eyes, her hands shaking, but she was resolute. She would not let this be the end. Not yet. Not for her children.